Hello, my name is Clorinda Donato, and I'm here to talk about the 3 essays on translation in the phenomenal Transnational Modern Languages Handbook, edited by Jennifer Burns and Derek Duncan, that appeared this year with Liverpool University Press. Organized in alphabetical order, as all articles in the handbook are, the 3 chapters titled Translation have been penned by authors whose pieces also appear in alphabetical order according to their last names. The first, number 34, signed Lucas Nunes Vieira, number 35 by Loredana Polezzi, and number 35 by Zrinka Salhujak. Like Tiro and D'Alembert's Encyclopédie, with its articles also in alphabetical order, the invitation of the handbook mirrors the one the editors of the Encyclopédie extended to their readers. Move through the content freely, selecting multiple itineraries that may bring you back to a particular article or cluster of articles multiple times, darting off to connect with another article prompted by one of the terms that appears in what you are reading, as I did when I ran across the terms multilingualism, language, stories, colonization, etc., since almost all of the terms that have chapters in the handbook can be found somewhere in the 3 chapters on translation. Or why not read the articles preceding and following a particular article, following the randomness alphabetical order imposes on content to discover connections among the parts that may have not appeared immediately obvious. However, in the case of the translation articles, if you start from Loredana Polezzi's article Translation, the middle child of the 3, you can move both forward and backward from 35 to 34 or 35 to 36 and still be in translation, which works very well as a reading strategy, but also, as we shall see, as the essence of translation practice: mobility, movement, and change, all within the same rubric of translation. Starting from the middle, Loredana Polezzi's contribution addresses the many negative representations of translation: the bumblebee that can barely rise, the traitor, and the myth of the grand gesture of the author as stabilizing trope that somehow generated these subaltern images, creating the equally highly anticipated and expected grand gesture of the translator, conceived as handmaid of the author, aspiring over and over again, indeed, forever aspiring to equivalence, the translator, of course, cast as the defective party. The translator will never be able to achieve the perfection of the author in the expectation of the creation of the perfect diet of equivalence, with all the responsibility for that perfection falling on the translator. That closed-in system never functioned very well, though, always leaving so many unanswered questions. Among them, why are there multiple translations of the same book in the same language if translators operate on the basis of equivalence and metaphor? Once again, using Loredana Polezzi's essay as a pivot among the 3 essays, she lays out for us the paradigm shift related to translation in our day and our ignorance about how translation and the role and place of the translator were viewed historically, which Zrinka Salhujak's article probes to reveal paradigm shifts in translation from antiquity and a recasting of our attention to the function of translation as transmission of knowledge, the sinew of the power relations involved. Zrinka takes us on a journey that in today's presentist historicism, we and our students rarely have the chance to remember. That translation was first and foremost about transmission. She reminds us that translation into a vernacular meant translation of power away from Latin and therefore away from the church. And it was translation, not authorship, that served as the primary model of cultural and knowledge production. The notion of original did not prevail. Zrinka's trans-temporal gaze is startling and informs Polezzi's send-up of the author as we realize we are living in similar circumstances today. But rather than replacing, it is translation as co-creation that is breaking through. the translator's visibility as partner, as Jennifer Croft, translator of Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk, has demanded. No longer handmade, but hand, together with the author. More hands meaning a widening as well of relationships between form and content, relationships that become collaborations of plurality. However, Żwinka also reminds us of how translation as transfer from Greco-Roman antiquity to the Middle Ages to the Renaissance in Europe was conceived of as the ability of vernacular languages and cultures to assume what had heretofore been the power of authoritative languages and cultures such as Greek and Latin to become in turn authoritative languages themselves, a situation that is particularly visible with French as lingua franca and not Italian, since French was tied to a nation and became an instrument of power, much as Nebrija had projected for Spanish when he presented the first grammar of Castilian to the Catholic Queen Isabella in 1492. As translator Julia Sanchez has noted, the vernacular is the language of mobility and paradoxically the most rooted geographically and temporally, and I would add, emotionally. Geography, time, and emotion certainly motivated Dante as they did Joachim du Bellay, leader of the Pléiade, the group of French Renaissance poets and philosophers of language who first promoted the standardization of French. But with a nation to build, in the case of France, Żwinka's focus on du Bellay and her contribution sheds light on the process whereby the translator becomes emulator of a previous hegemony. No longer interested in transmitting the knowledge of the ancients, du Bellay moves to replace the ancients with French authors and Latin and Greek with French through a process of erasure rather than transfer, collaboration, and coexistence. And while the vernacular's agency lives within its fluctuating rootedness, we can trace the stages of its slowing mobility through commensuration, which Żwinka identifies as the third term of intermediary between the two terms of translation. As the vernacular's motion slows, we may measure its changing vitality. Measurement in translation also fully informs Lucas Nunes Vieira's piece, also titled Translation, but focused on machine translation and focused on machine language and machine translation, terms that we have gotten used to hearing, but terms that are no less jarring in their juxtaposition of what used to be our definition of language as that which makes us human and machines. Do humans even own language anymore? Nunes Vieira argues from the perspective of current use practice many of the theoretical, temporal, spatial, and hegemonic considerations presented by Polezzi and Stalhujak. He reminds us of the diversity of the study of translation and technology, and that it is not strictly focused on the linguistic relationship between source and target texts, nor specific languages, countries, cultures, or genre for that matter, in its examination of concepts, patterns, and procedures. And it is very much concerned with practical measurabilities, its own commensuration, as it lines up temporal, in this case, the time it takes to execute a translation, cognitive, that is the mental effort required to complete a translation, and physical or mechanical effort, as in the effort involved in typing. Human and machine translation, Vieira reminds us, are not mutually exclusive, but complementary. Let me end with a thought from Byung-Chul Han's new volume, Hyperculture, Culture and Globalization, to offer closure to this brief consideration of the translation articles in the Transnational Modern Languages Handbook. Byung-Chul Han describes culture today as unbound, unrestricted, unraveled, a hyperculture of intense hybridization, fusion, and co-appropriation. He asks provocatively if we even belong to our cultures anymore. As we think about translation in these three articles, we might ask the same thing about language. Do we belong to our languages anymore? Do they belong to us? What happens in the multilingual brain? In a recent interview, Jennifer Croft, when asked about her process and the effect of knowing so many languages, answered that she experiences what she refers to as a fluid proto-language that surrounds her when she translates. We note the spatial and tangible elements of what she calls proto-language coming through from multilingualism. Translation, conceived of in this way, is interchangeably process and product, ever adapting to input temporally, cognitively, physically, and often mechanically, as these three translation essays demonstrate. In modern language programs today, where translation is now requested by students for its applicability in the workplace, after reading these three essays, I am even more convinced that we face a daunting but necessary challenge to rethink how we define and teach translation. The handbook and these essays on translation could not be more timely. Thank you very much.